The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Susan Sweeney, one of the deans at eLearningU, and I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Which Google Ad is Right for Your Tourism Business? For anybody that's new on the call, we go for about 50 minutes of great content, and then we have about 10 minutes of Q&A. And we do our Q&A one of two ways. You can type your question in the question area as we go along, and I will read those out to our expert, Kelly Kubrick, today. Alternatively, if you'd like to speak directly to Kelly, just hold your question, and when we get into the Q&A time period, click on the little hand symbol on your control panel. That lights up on my screen and lets me know that you want me to unmute you. So I will give you a heads up, call you by your first name. I will unmute you. You'll be able to speak to Kelly to get your question answered. Everybody will be able to hear the question. Everybody can hear the answer. And once your question's been answered to your satisfaction, I will then mute you and we'll go on to the next question. Kelly's been nice enough to give you a copy of the handout. It's in the handout section. So you can just go into the handout section on your control panel and drag and drop or save file as. And so our expert today is Kelly Kubrick. Kelly is the owner of Online Authority, COO of a Canadian e-commerce company, MyLibertyLife.life, and co-author of The 6 Dimensions of Digital Maturity Model. At Online Authority, Kelly delivers custom training in digital analytics and digital media buying. At MyLiberty, she wrestles the marketing technology stack to the ground. Kelly co-founded and served as chair of Digital Strategy Conference. Previously, Kelly served as director of e-commerce development with Time Warner subsidiary Time Consumer Marketing, Inc. in New York. Kelly, so happy to have you with us and really looking forward to your program today.
Thank you, Susan, and hello, everyone. I hope everyone's ready to dive into some content here. As Susan said, looking forward to any questions you might have. And in the meantime, let's launch straight in. So, Susan, thank you very much for the introduction. The only other thing I was just going to mention to folks is that so digital media buying today is actually a fairly mature area, just because, as you'll see, so I was shocked to realize it's been 17 years of buying and running advertising campaigns on the different networks, Google, Facebook, and LinkedIn. But we're obviously going to focus on Google today and its particular quirks and opportunities. So to that end, this is the agenda I'd like to cover off with everyone today. So I'm just going to step off with just an overview of what's included nowadays in Google Ads. Google made a very conscious choice not too long ago to rebrand itself from what we all grew up with, which was Google AdWords, and it now calls itself Google Ads. And a main reason for that is the types of creative that you can now run on Google Ads is much broader than just the old text-based AdWords ads. So Google Ads, they are hinting at the availability of placements and creative and opportunities that didn't exist previously. So that's the big change that's essentially happening, is you can do a lot more. But as a result of it, it's even that much more complicated to get a handle on it. So I'd like to do an overview of what kinds of creatives are being run nowadays from a tourism perspective. And then we'll actually go through a typical cost versus response rate to the advertising, and then how I might budget and what kind of return you can anticipate. So that's going to be sort of the quant section. Got some tables for you. And then a very typical question that I hear a lot from folks is, what is an acceptable acquisition cost? So we're just going to talk that through, because that's really a function of your own business, but how we calculate it. And then I've just pulled a series of tips that I wanted to make sure you've got in place or that you're thinking about in order to succeed at Google Ads. So with that, the overview I just wanted to cover off is, so Google Ads is now a 19-year-old teenager. It encompasses 3 separate networks, and depending on the network, that's where you may see a difference in the available creative and the available types of creative you can run and the available placements. So there is the one most people are most familiar with, which is the Google Search Network, and that includes the text-based ads where you're purchasing against keywords. but shopping also now falls into that. So we're just going to touch very briefly on what Google Ads shopping includes, because there is a possible application for tourism entities in there. And then there's the Google Display Network, which is, instead of text ads, you're talking about banner ads. But the availability of rich media is actually very, I think, conducive to the tourism world nowadays. It also includes the opportunity to advertise within the Gmail interface. So if any of you are Gmail users, you may have seen some of these ads, but it's just, again, it's another placement, as each one of these networks, Google, Facebook, LinkedIn included, are constantly looking for new inventory they can sell. And so the placements that are available to you tend to be radically different even than a few months earlier. And then the third big network that's covered off with Google Ads is YouTube. So essentially, to place a video ad buy, you're essentially running it on the YouTube network. And this is probably the biggest growth area. And there's tremendous opportunity, I think, for tourism organizations to really show off the experience they can offer to potential customers through video. So just very roughly, 230,000 companies currently using Google Ads, concentrated predominantly in the US still. But I was surprised that the hospitality number is relatively low, frankly, in terms of the number of so to me, there's opportunity for hospitality organizations that may have not ventured into this world just yet. Not surprisingly, because it really is the big monster in this space, about a third of every dollar being spent on digital ads nowadays is actually going to Google Ads. The showdown is between Google, Facebook, and the theory is Amazon is actually creeping up on everyone. But that may not be relevant unless you've got a merchandise play. So to that end, that's the first kind of thing we just wanted to talk through. I'm going to be talking about the reach that you have, the opportunity you have in terms of reach on both Google and YouTube. So this is just, these numbers are always mind-boggling and they get updated constantly, but not surprisingly, Google's got about 90% market share. My favorite stat here, 63,000 searches per second on any given day. And what's intriguing to me is 15% of searches have never actually been searched before. So this is what we call emergent keyword opportunities, and this is something you should be thinking through, which is there are phrases no one is bidding on because no one's ever thought of them before. I'd be curious to know whether all of you would agree or disagree with this, but the stats are showing that most of us are conducting 3 to 4 searches per day as we tootle around in life. On the YouTube side, we're up to 2 billion monthly active users, or 30 million a day. 73% of US adults are using YouTube actively. The billion hours of content viewed per day, to me, the most intriguing number in here, about a quarter of that, or 250 million hours, are actually being watched on TV screens now instead of phone apps. So I don't know if anyone in your household is a YouTube streamer on your TV, but this is a whole new behavioral thing. And for it to have taken up that much of the hours already is intriguing. 500 hours of content uploaded to YouTube every minute. So there's a huge growth here in terms of available inventory that can be bought and sold, which actually makes it a more cost-effective network, I think, at the moment than some of the other placements on Google. So what you have here is we're just going to walk through some of the visuals, or some visuals, pardon me, of the creative that's and the placement that's available, just so everyone can wrap their heads around what your ad might look like. On the left, you'll see what I would call a traditional search ad. So the search that I did was Manhattan food tours, and the first 3 results you see are for different food tour companies offering a Manhattan experience. You'll notice that the ad is very clearly designated as such. And this is the classic Google search ad that we've all seen for many, many years. The big difference on the Google side right now is that the inventory of that initial search result is now heavily dominated by ads, heavily dominated by the maps. And so organic search results are getting pushed further and further down the page. So a lot of people are literally buying their way back into visibility through these paid ads. I just wanted to also mention, because this I think makes it a little more helpful for everyone. If you look down at that third ad, so food tours in Manhattan, New York, make your trip memorable. You'll notice food tours Manhattan, which is a variation on the search I did, are bolded. So this is just a reminder that Google is basically trying to make it easy for the consumer to note the phrase they search for and the result and what the relationship is there. So that's the most traditional Google search ad. But what I wanted to show you on the right is what that would look like if you were doing the buy on YouTube instead of on Google. So same search, Manhattan YouTube, excuse me, Manhattan food tour. And what you're seeing there is a text-based ad at the top of a string of videos that are available. I'm pretty sure that second advertiser is that first advertiser is the second advertiser over on the left. So it's interesting to see, we can see the company is buying in both placements. So the driver for each of these is essentially reach, the volume of potential visitors you can access through both the search network and the YouTube network is enormous. And so essentially it's the equivalent of kind of buying broadcast media nowadays in terms of the numbers of millions of users you're able to access based on your keyword searches. What we typically see is that on these two platforms, you're really accessing, or you're supporting, pardon me, a strategy related to search intent. So the end user has a particular thing they are looking for, and you're able to present the ad accordingly. So it tends to be a little bit lower in the funnel because people are looking for a particular experience, or they're looking for a particular destination. And so you're essentially able to show that back to them. So it's less of, and of course it works for brand as well, but the idea here is people have something they're looking for, and ideally you can be in front of them with your ad as a result of it. The second category, the next category, pardon me, of the Google Ads, I'm not frankly 100% sure how relevant this could be, but the reason you would have this is if you sell merchandise related to your tourism facility or your tourism service, or something along those lines, if there's an event. And so I use the excuse of one of the great tourism opportunities out there, Super Bowl. So what you're seeing here is a different creative. So Super Bowl merchandise was the search, and what you see is a series of ads at the top of the page showing a piece of merchandise, supporting the title of the merchandise, showing price, and showing brand. So 4 distinct pieces of the creative. And these are what are called shopping ads that are available. This is really only applicable if you have merchandise and are actively selling it through e-commerce on your website. So you're essentially supporting a purchase intent versus a search intent. So if someone is actually looking for a good. The ads are actually populated automatically through a data feed from your e-commerce system. That sounds really scary, but depending on which e-commerce system you use, there's a lot of apps that exist nowadays that automate this and make it a lot less scary sounding. So just as an example, if you have a Shopify store somehow related to your facility or your merchandising area, the feed literally pulls automatically from Shopify into Google Ads. So it depends on which tool you're using, but I put it out there just in case there is some opportunity for merchandise sales for you. The next one is the display ads available. And what we're going to do is just, let's see if this will work, Susan. I just wanted to go off-site for a second. That link that's available, you'll see it in there, is the richmediagallery.com is actually Google's collective availability of different creatives that have been run as rich media. So you can actually search for some tourism ones yourselves at your leisure. But in the meantime, what I just wanted to show everyone, and we'll go through a couple of different ones, is the difference with the display network is, as you can see, so there's 2 different ads I'm showing here. There is an example of a page layout of any content website on the planet. And there is an ad being dropped into a square ad being dropped into this editorial content, whereas over here, a banner ad is being placed at the top of the content. So essentially what happens with the display network is your ad is being placed inside other content related to your category. So I just wanted to show a couple of examples so folks could see what is being done with this rich media concept. So very different from a text ad, and very different, of course, from a shopping ad. So what's happening is it's just going to load up, and what you can see is as the ad loads, there's an instruction to the user, hover to follow your guide. This just happens to be the call to action for this particular. But when I hover my mouse over, what happens is the ad pops up and you'll be taken into a completely different experience. So in this case, the idea is you pick your guide. Are you interested in learning more about the destinations, the culture, the gastronomy, the wedding? And so it gives people an opportunity to basically get a bit more of an experience as they click in and through the different ads. I think something's up with their particular ad because the Google map is not showing, but it essentially gives you the idea that you can have a bit more of an immersive editorial experience. I'm just going to close this one down so we can go look at another one. But the idea is essentially you are taking advantage of somebody who's in a bit more of a strolling mood to go through the content. And you can see it really does offer a very different experience for someone versus just reading a text ad. So this next one, Tourism New Zealand, same thing. Once I hover over the ad, there's a complete what we call a takeover of the screen. So you have the opportunity here to show people a lot more. They can go in and visit different sections. What I typically see on the tourism side is this is being used for the idea of more of a lead generation opportunity where people actually, you want them to sign up to receive some sort of brochure or sign up to receive something else. So it basically, it's a different kind of conversion online, but it is interesting to see that you can essentially take advantage of more than just a plain old ad that is very what I would call, oh, I don't know, less fun. Text ads are not hugely fun. And then just another example, this is British Columbia. It's a different takeover concept, but same idea. It loads into editorial content. And once the ad populates, you're instructed to roll over to expand. It expands and takes over the screen. You have the opportunity of very high production quality photos. You can help the user engage more. They can see more. There can be more available. Okay, so these are just a couple of tourism ones that I picked out, but as I mentioned, you can go in and see a lot of the different creative on this richmediagallery.com. So up we go into here. Just as part of, again, just the placements that are available, so the fact that Google is now running ads in Gmail is one other example. So this is just a screenshot from my own Gmail, and you'll see there's 2 ads running at the top of my inbox, both related to technologies I've been looking at recently. So essentially Google's trying to put ads in front of me that relate to the kinds of content I'm currently interested. It is intriguing and a little bit distressing, but you can see just how much Google is able to take advantage of what it knows about all of us. Moving on to the video ads, which is essentially running on the YouTube network. So the driver we're looking at here, it's still reach. You're still talking about just the sheer size of the audience, but we're now looking at the opportunity to include video. So to me, this is an intriguing opportunity for all of you because essentially we can show people rather than trying to tell them what a potential experience is going to be like. In my experience, the YouTube ads tend to support more of an awareness strategy versus a conversion strategy. But if you're trying to introduce a new offering, or if you're trying to give people a feel for a new facility, or if you're trying to let them know about a new experience that's available to them, I just wanted to mention, because this is one of those trip up points, to do this well, you really do need to have a YouTube channel page. So that's just yet one more digital property you both have to populate, brand, and manage. but it's worth doing it because your ads are essentially housed on your channel page. So what we're looking at here is the search was for heliskiing, and there's two variations on the ads that are presented. This depends on the placement that you purchase when you're putting in your media buy through Google Ads for the YouTube network. So you'll see there's an ad running for Best BC Heliskiing Experience. It is a text-based ad, whereas the one below it, you'll see it's an ad and it's specifically a video ad. So if somebody clicked on that and watched some or all of the video ad, you're able to offer them a very different experience on what they can anticipate were they to follow through with your offer. There's also a placement on YouTube that is what we call in-stream placements. So this is a bit complicated, so everybody follow me on here. What happens here is that as the user is navigating YouTube, and I'm not sure if any of you are YouTube watchers, but it's a little bit like going down a rabbit hole where you start looking at one video and then you get introduced to another idea, and you can spend quite a bit of time on there. YouTube is taking advantage of that by giving us this in-stream placement concept. So my initial search was a best spa vacation, and as I cruised around looking at different videos, I actually ended up much further down a rabbit hole where I was looking at spa vacations specifically in Hawaii. I then was presented with this top 9 Waikiki, Hawaii search result. And as I clicked through to watch that video, an in-stream ad was presented to me for an event taking place here in Ottawa. It's a theater event, but the idea is the ad that was placed in front of me was tied to my location. And so there's 3 separate branding opportunities being given to you where you're seeing the actual video running, and that's a live shot of the actual theater. The learn more down on the lower left where there's a small call to action, and then on the upper right there's yet another opportunity. So this in-stream idea in our experience again is working. It seems to work quite well versus the other placement, which is called a discovery placement. But the idea that you can insert some content into someone else's stream. Sometimes it's aggravating and sometimes it works, but that's the whole point of advertising. You've got to test and see what actually works for you. So to that end, which one might be right for you and your business? It essentially, to me, depends on how well you can actually leverage the key ad network characteristics. A huge challenge in this space is having content that is of a production quality that is enough to help people really understand the potential experience you're offering them. So if you are selling an experience, definitely consider video. In the sense that it shows people versus a text-based ad that tells people. Videos do not have to be long, videos do not have to be complicated, and videos do not have to be perfect. The tools available to most of us today, just from a simple iPhone forward, means that you don't have to run long ads. There's also a lot of tools out there that basically provide templates that allow you to customize them. But from the standpoint of showing somebody what they could have versus merely telling them, I do think video is a very strong tool. On the other hand, if the strategy you're pursuing at the moment, this quarter, for example, is that you're looking to generate a lead opportunity that allows you to capture consumer data so that you can market to them through other channels, whether it's a direct mail of a brochure or something like that. Again, consider some of those display ads that give you the chance to really show them a fabulous image, again, versus a text that merely tells. So that was the rich media display ads. And again, you are going to need to invest in the content development, but in a lot of cases, I think people do have some pretty amazing both photography and video assets that could certainly be used repeatedly in these content opportunities. Either way, whether you do choose to do video or you choose to do display, I do recommend that you still support both with a search campaign. Essentially, you should be targeting the phrases that are relevant to you. So, of course, your brand, but also potentially the destination or the dates or whatever it is that you are hoping to drive business for what I would call mid and lower funnel versus some of the upper funnel video opportunities and the display ads. So we still, it should just be table stakes to be doing some kind of a search campaign. But again, if you do have some content that shows off the best of what you've got into these different networks, consider this in addition to search. And then of course, if you do have ancillary merchandise that you're already selling via e-commerce, definitely consider the Google Shopping ads concept, simply because it is so gloriously automatable that once it is set up, you're basically able to just let it run on a low burn, but only relevant if you have merchandise. So what would you do next? So let's say you do choose that it's time to take advantage of some of these new opportunities. I have made a basic assumption, of course, that you have budget allocated. So the budget to me is, whether it's all in one or separate, I'm not sure, but you do need, of course, budget for creative development. So the text, the video, the landing pages that you're going to be driving traffic to. And I would also recommend, as part of that, you do invest the time to create what Google calls extensions. There's a lot of additional copy that you can include in these variations on ads that are basically snippets of short text for variations on headlines, on callouts, what are called site links. It's every time you go into Google Ads, there's sort of another place you could potentially insert text. How it's being inserted is a little bit black box of Google, but the idea is you do want to take the time to put in your taglines, your call outs, whatever you've got available into that content. So don't just create one ad, make sure you actually take the time to create the extensions. So whether that copy is being written by yourself, your team, or a third party, just make sure that the creative and development is has some time allocated for that. Then in addition, of course, you would need a budget for the actual media buy. And the easiest way to think this through is to start with a per day concept. So for example, I am going to spend $5 per day. And then you roll it up to what I call an overtime model. So if it's $5 a day, then it's $35 a week, $5 times 7 days, or $150 per month. So something really basic just to get your numbers in line. The question then becomes, is that $150 per month per network? Or across the network? So is it $150 per month for all of Google, or $150 per month for a Google search spend, a YouTube spend, a display spend, or whatever the case may be? So just have a number in your head so that you can actually start to work through some of the indicators related to this. So once you have some kind of a budget, you then would model some of the key indicators. So cost and response, and then a budget return scenario. So what we're going to do is just walk through this. I just wanted to give everyone a few benchmarks. This is coming from Espresso, which is one of my favorite resources for digital marketing. They do superb content constantly. But this is a recent cost and response benchmark that Google apparently shared with them. That's the source. So there's two metrics we're looking at here. The average cost per click, which is typically how you are purchasing, certainly for Google search. And then the click-through rate you can anticipate, and click-through would be the percentage of people who see your ad and actually respond to it by clicking. So you'll see there's a whole bunch of different verticals, but most importantly, travel and tourism, according to Google. I'm not sure if this is everyone's experience, but they're claiming a dollar cost per click rate and a 6.1% click-through rate. Again, not sure if that's everyone's experiences. To me, those are both slightly optimistic. If it's still $1, that's great. That's essentially very cheap. You'll see the e-commerce rate down below at 880. In my experience, is certainly a little more typical. And then the response rate, the average click-through, pardon me, I also think that's a little optimistic. But the idea anyways, if those are benchmarks, you can compare performance for yourself. So keep those in mind, because this is the way to walk down this concept of a budget and return scenario. In my Time Warner background, we would never have modeled a profit and loss statement without assuming a minimum of these three scenarios. So a conservative scenario, a moderate scenario, an aggressive scenario, meaning how well the campaign ran. But if we start with this, so let's just go down the conservative scenario for a sec. So if your ad is clicked on 100 times and your tourism click-through rate on Google Ads is slightly less optimistic than the benchmark, 5%, with a potential conversion rate, and I always have a very conservative conversion rate, so only 1%, and your average tourism per click cost would be 75 cents, pardon me, a click, then you'll spend $75 in order to get a single conversion. Now, that might seem very high to everyone, but remember, we're talking about the difference between a conversion and acquisition cost versus a per click cost. So you'll see on the moderate versus aggressive scenarios, those columns, I simply modified some of the assumptions. So you have fewer click-throughs, but you have a higher conversion rate. So you may spend less in order to get a single acquisition, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see the whole idea here is that you simply want to make a couple of assumptions ahead of time going in. But let's say the acquisition cost for a single customer through a Google ad is anywhere from 50 to 75 bucks. It could be. So how does that translate into, would you actually consider those results acceptable? So this is where we go back to this idea of the acquisition cost. You should know that ahead of time going in, and Google simply then just becomes part of your acquisition cost mix. But acquisition costs, of course, this may be 101 for everybody, but I just want to double check that you've got a model in your head. Time Warner, we had a variation on these different models, so it'll depend a little bit on your organizational culture. But acquisition costs are essentially a function of the customer lifetime value model you use internally. So what is a customer worth to your business over 1, or it could be 2 or 3 years? We typically used a 3-year model at Time Warner because this related to the publishing business's quirks, which is many people will keep, for example, a magazine subscription for about 3 years before they may suffer from fatigue, may be less interested. So we could expect a customer to stay with us for about 3 years. So how much is that customer worth to you in revenue over year 1 or over year 2 or 3 years? And given that revenue opportunity that they represent, what dollar amount, are you willing to acquire him or her for? So if you can anticipate $1,000 worth of revenue off a customer in 1 year, what dollar volume or a dollar amount are you willing to spend in order to get them? So if it's an $1,000 revenue value of 1 year of revenue off a customer, 1% of that, $10, would be considered actually quite low. But 5%, you might be willing to spend $50 to get someone who's worth $1,000 to you, or you might go as high as 10%, which would assume that you have an acceptable acquisition cost of $100. That could be the case. It's going to depend entirely on your business. What you want to do is model that in advance and then actually compare your acquisition costs for Google as a performance channel to other potentially non-performance marketing spend. So I just did a really quick pie chart for everybody here, just so you can see what I mean by this. So if I stick just with Google, and I threw Facebook in there for the fun of it. So Google search versus Google shopping versus Google YouTube versus Google display versus Facebook. So what that acquisition cost is for you, it could vary by these different channels, but the way to look at them is across these channels so you can decide what you're willing to spend in each one. It could be that Facebook is more expensive than search for you, or vice versa. That's going to depend entirely on the business, but that's why it's a little easier to start with a flat rate budget so that you can then start to model these things and say, okay, so I'm willing to test for this amount of money for this length of time, and then you can settle into what, which ones are actually working for you. So with that, I just wanted to shift over to, if this does interest you and you are kind of willing to dive a little deeper into Google Ads, what are the trip points and how best can you succeed in this area. So I think that the first thing I would absolutely say is to please allocate time to this. You need to learn, your staff needs to learn enough about this that you feel confident that you would be willing to potentially outsource or hire a body against this, not necessarily a full-time headcount, mind you, but the idea that pursuing Google as an acquisition channel from the paid side, it does take some time, and you do need to invest in a little bit because there's a whole new interface to learn here. Secondly, really think through those different characteristics I talked about, the different placements and the different creative. What can you succeed at without having to develop an entirely new creative strategy? Do please conduct keyword research, and I've got a slide after this just to talk about this, because the keyword research, in terms of its value to you, actually has a bunch of different ways in this world. It's not merely the first-time keyword research. We actually take advantage of it in a couple of different places. Ideally, undertake some competitor research as well, see who is running these ads in what placements, so that you can see what you're up against. And I would have encouraged you, or have you encourage, or even potentially even require your marketing team to take some of the training and certifications that's available in these areas. There is enough quirks and changes in the interface that I think it's worth giving them the time to actually get the chance to learn. Most of this stuff is available as online learning. Please go ahead and pursue these, because it's worth it to make sure that you don't make mistakes in media buying online. I do strongly recommend that folks consider outsourcing initially their Google ad spend to some sort of reputable firm or freelancer. The reason I recommend this is there's quite a bit of administrivia and in the weeds sort of necessity of initial account and campaign setup. You want to make sure your analytics are hooked into your Google ads, all this sort of stuff. And people who do this all day, every day are simply faster and better. Just go ahead and work with them to get set up and running and get your campaigns kicked off. However, I would still recommend your team is monitoring the spend and your acquisition key performance indicators during that time, and set an objective, if only to keep the third party accountable, that basically says, let's say within 6 months, you do plan to bring it in-house. I've seen this model go back and forth, and I don't think it's a bad thing if you keep it in-house, put it out of, outsource, bring it back in. The reason I suggest this is that, again, the folks who do Google Ads 24/7 are very plugged into the quirks of the interface and can really help you avoid problems. But you do want to also make sure you bring it back in-house every once in a while, so you can be sure that your team could step in if need be. I just think we swing it back and forth quite regularly as needed and as time is available. I just wanted to mention this keyword research. That was one of the bullets in the last slide as well, just because this has always been a part of Google AdWords and remains a part of Google Ads today. There is lots of keyword tools out there. Google provides you with a free one called the Keyword Planner tool. It's built into your Google Ads account, and it essentially provides what I would call demand level data. So what's the average number of monthly searches for a given phrase, and it's segmented by geography and device. This is really important to do ahead of time so that you're not bidding on in phrases that don't make sense, or you're bidding on it, or you're potentially overbidding for highly competitive phrases versus taking advantage of potentially lower demand phrases and the costs that come with that. I do recommend you do this keyword research not only for the initial campaign setup and kickoff. You'll need that, of course, to structure the actual campaign hierarchy, because you want to be bidding on like phrases as you're bidding as you set up your ad campaigns. But it's also really important to incorporate those insights into the landing pages that you create, the ads that you write, whether it's text, whether it's video, the optimization of those videos. There's lots of places to actually insert keyword text as you upload videos into YouTube. And then, of course, in your YouTube channel page itself. All of this insight should be regularly incorporated into each one of your campaigns. You don't want to do keyword research once and then never go back. To me, it should be a quarterly exercise that potentially changes the campaign and the campaign focus as you get more and more insight. So with that, I just was going to put this back. So this is what we've covered off. We did an ads overview in terms of the placements and creatives that are available. Which one is best is a function of what you can leverage best. We talked about some cost and response rates, talked about some budget and return scenarios, what your acceptable acquisition costs would be, and some of the tips I've proposed. But that pretty much covers off what I wanted to make sure we got through in our session today. So I'd be happy to take any questions if there are any. Please let me know, and Susan, I'll leave you to step in and help me on that phase.
Awesome, Kelly. That was really, really interesting, and kind of brings up a whole lot of other things. It'd be a really challenging thing to, if you haven't done it before, to really get in and figure out where that ad should go and what it's actually going to cost. So it's a really interesting session. Thank you. For anybody that joined us late, we do our questions one of two ways. You can type your question in the question area and I will read those out to Kelly. Alternatively, if you'd like to speak directly to Kelly, just click on the little hand symbol in your control panel. It lights up on my screen and lets me know you want me to unmute you. I'll call you by your first name, give you a heads up, and unmute you. When you talk to Kelly to get your question answered, everybody can hear the question and everybody can hear the answer. Once your question's been answered to your satisfaction, I will then mute you again. We'll go on to the next question. And just before we get into the Q&A, don't forget to register for next week, SEO 201, with an emphasis on organic link building via video assets with Brent Payne. So let's make sure that you get registered for that. So let's get into our questions. The first question is, let me get down here. If you're replacing a text ad on a platform where people are looking for video, is the CTR good enough?
I think from the standpoint of, is the CTR good enough, that will obviously come out of the campaign, but in my experience, yes. So essentially what's happening is the placement itself, what we're seeing is very reasonable, and I'm talking specifically, folks, for YouTube ads here. Even if you're running either a video ad or a text ad within there, we're certainly seeing engagement rates that make me want to keep buying on Google. So I don't know whether over time the video will swamp the text ad. But from what I can tell, yes, it's still worth doing because, and it could be simply that it's presenting a different experience at the top of the screen. But the content is definitely being read and I would pursue it. So yes, I would say the click-throughs are acceptable.
Okay, great. Next question is, in your budget/return scenarios, was that $75 for each conversion, i.e. hotel reservation?
Yes, it was. So I was trying, it was a little difficult to, the data that Google shares, that Google likes to share, is purely click-through data. So it likes to tout how many clicks you can anticipate for the number of impressions your ad is given. So if your ad is shown 100 times and one person clicks on it, they like to share that click-through rate. But in my experience, the click-through rate is a bit of a vanity metric because what we really want is the conversion. So how many times does the ad have to be shown, clicked on, and ultimately converted into a reservation, whether it's a hotel reservation or a tour reservation, etc. So yeah, so to me, the acquisition cost will be a much higher cost than the cost per click.
Okay, now can you just speak briefly to the ad for a long tail keyword versus an ordinary 2 or 3 word, i.e. If your ad appears when somebody does a search for downtown Madison, Wisconsin hotel with a pool, as opposed to just hotel Madison, Wisconsin.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just scribbling the phrase down so I'm seeing it in my head. Yeah, so basically when you are bidding on keywords, Google gives you a pretty nice delineation on how you want the bid to be purchased, or how you want the bid to basically be in the auction. What I mean by that is that you can take a phrase, like, I'll just take a shortened version. So let's say downtown Madison Hotel. That can either be what we call a broad match search, a phrase match search, or an exact match search. And you can bid on all three. The exact match will have fewer searches, but will potentially be cheaper for you. And what we mean by that is you're instructing Google, only show my ad if someone types exactly this. Or in a phrase match case, show my ad if someone does a search for phrases that include this but could be longer. For example, downtown Madison, Wisconsin hotel with a pool. Your ad would still show if you had done a phrase match. And then broad match is the widest possible net. So a broad match bid would basically mean if Madison Hotel had been the search and your ad is presented. So it gives you the widest audience, but you tend to spend money quickly with broad match. So most folks that I've worked with over time get very opinionated on which phrases they're willing to bid on for phrase and exact, and you can certainly bid on both versions. So the whole idea is the longer the tail of the keyword, you can choose to bid on a shorter version of that and still get the traffic, or you can actually bid on that long of a phrase. What we've seen over time is that Google searchers are writing longer and longer queries. So there's a funny human characteristic that appears to be taking place where we treat Google like a person and we ask Google a full question. So we're definitely seeing longer and longer phrases. And so there are what we call modifiers that allow us to capture that longer tail stuff. If it's a really long tail phrase that you want an exact bid on, you may get very few people doing that search. But there's a lot of controls in the Google Ads interface that let you play with this. And this to me is an example of what I talked about with why it may be worth in the short term outsourcing some of this, because the folks that live, eat, and breathe the match types are the ones you want setting your bids so you don't overspend or underspend. I hope that's not too much detail, but it is an intriguing management tool that's available to you in Google.
But would you agree that you'll get a higher conversion on a longer search? So if somebody searches on Branson, Missouri hotels, they're probably just, starting to do their research. If somebody says Branson, Missouri hotel, downtown with a pool, they're closer to making a purchase.
Yes, sorry. And if I didn't address that, I apologize. Yes, if it is a longer tail term that carries with it more intent, I would expect a higher conversion rate off of it. Right. So I think that's absolutely a fair expectation to set. So as people get further and further down the research line, you will definitely see these longer phrases. And yes, to me, it is absolutely worth bidding on longer terms. The difficulty comes from, will you get it exactly right? But the more specific the search, if your ad can be put up in front of those folks, the higher the likelihood of a conversion off of it.
Right. Okay, great. Next thing is, do you think the ROI is better on Facebook or Google?
So from a conversion standpoint, I would say absolutely Google. What we're seeing on paid Facebook versus paid Google is that Facebook is much better at the top of funnel stuff. So lots of awareness traffic. To me, it's a great buy for doing things like building an email list. If you do a trade-off with a consumer and give them a great piece of content if they give up their email. Facebook absolutely rocks at that. I find the conversion rate off of Facebook nowhere near as good as off of Google. So we tend to use a mix where Facebook is used to drive, higher traffic, more top of funnel, but we absolutely use Google for conversion traffic and also remarketing traffic. So the idea is Google allows you to retarget people who have, for example, visited your site off of a past search. And we find the conversion rate off Google's remarketing much better than also off of Facebook's remarketing. So I would absolutely include Google in the mix from a conversion standpoint.
Okay, great. The next question is, this is way over my head. What are the kinds of things you should look for in an outside resource?
Got it. So the Google Ads interface is fundamentally overwhelming. Google has packed so much into the interface in a desperate attempt to be efficient. The problem is it's got 19 years of history in that interface. So the first time you go into Google Ads, you are literally going to have a small anxiety attack. I don't want that to happen, which is why I strongly recommend your initial campaign, your initial setup be done with an expert, whether it's a firm, whether it's a freelancer. Ideally, it's someone who has experience in the vertical you're in. But the whole idea is that you don't want to pay for your own learning curve with this. So get the account set up, get the first campaign set up, have a third party help you get extensions written, ad copy written, and do that initial campaign, and make sure they also owe you some kind of performance reporting on an ongoing basis. But if you chicken out completely and don't take some ownership of this process, you will find yourself a year from now still very fuzzy on what it is that you're buying. And I don't want that. So I want you to do an efficient setup, but learn enough that you feel comfortable hiring or firing that third party at a later date. And for the heck of it, set it up with a deadline. So 6 months from now, let's revisit, or 3 months from now, depending on the size of your team. But this is an area I think it is worth getting a strong enough understanding that you would be comfortable knowing when the time is to ramp it up and bring in outside resources or otherwise. So again, my recommendation, if you do not have any kind of Google Ads presence at all, start with a reputable firm or freelancer to get you up and running. Set a 3 or 6 month deadline on that relationship. And in the interim, make sure you and your team are getting training so that you are comfortable stepping in at the end of that deadline or renewing. It's up to you. But I worry that people think it's straightforward, start, and then have a moment where they just feel overwhelmed and back out, and then the campaign never actually gets off the ground.
Okay, great. I'm down to the last 2 questions, so if anybody has anything they'd like to have covered in the program, please get it in now. The next thing is, how would we calculate our customer lifetime value? We're a hotel with some regular business customers, but mostly transients.
So I would start with the idea of some sort of range of, I'll use room rate as an example. So whatever you anticipate the revenue for a customer, I would probably do it on a single night basis to be. So whatever that room rate, average room rate is that you can anticipate, times whether it's 1 or more nights. If it's transient, I assume it's 1 night. So I'm just going to throw a number out. I know this is probably way too low, but let's just keep the numbers round. So if it's $100 a night, and you anticipate only ever seeing that customer once, your lifetime value for that customer in 1 year is only $100. And so your acceptable acquisition cost is going to be a lot lower, because basically what you're saying is, if this person's worth $100 to me, I am willing to spend either 1%, 5%, or 10% of that $100 in order to acquire them. On the other hand, if your customer value is actually a little bit higher than that, and I would have expected it to be, because the customer either represents a room night and a meal, or a room night and some sort of bar spending, it could be that your base revenue per customer is actually a little bit higher, and therefore you might have a bit more wiggle room on your acquisition costs. I'll go back to a Time Warner example just to make the numbers very specific. So if you are interested in the Sports Illustrated magazine, typical annual subscription of Sports Illustrated is about $20. We assumed that we would keep you, just because of our own data, on an average of 3 years. So you're worth $60 to us in circulation revenue. The brand manager for Sports Illustrated would then decide how much they were willing to spend to acquire that customer. And it was pretty low. Like, we're not talking thousands of dollars here. We're talking, maybe $3, $4, $5 to acquire a customer. And so you would spend that, because also the other model in the publishing business is that we would actually get more revenue off the advertising dollars from the magazine sold. But circulation marketing was expected to be profitable. So that would be the way you would do it. So you'd calculate what is a typical revenue opportunity per hotel guest per night, and then figure out if that's over 1 year, or if you would do a model that's longer than that, and then what percentage. And I would assume you're willing to spend at least 10% of that to acquire another customer. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay.
And the last question, unless someone gets another one in, is what's the biggest challenge with working with Google Ads?
So I would say that it is the number of incremental hidden components. So what I mean by that is, you think you're just creating an ad, but what Google then asks you is for additional information, like, oh, could you give me a bit more copy, because I'd like to show what's called an extension of your ad. So Google's trying to give you an opportunity as an advertiser to make your ad, from the search perspective, bigger than it actually is. So it wants to be able to show what it calls call extensions. So it wants to be able to show your phone number. It wants to be able to show call outs of little headlines or calls to action. It wants to be able to provide additional descriptive copy. And so this is probably, to me, one of the biggest challenges is you think, phew, we wrote an ad, we're done. But really what you want to do is write one ad and then write at least a second ad so you can test response one against the other. Oh, and by the way, could you please write the site extension? Could you write the call out extension? Could you write all these other additional pieces of copy? And it gets aggravating, but it's worth pushing through and producing additional copy, and then it's stored in the account so you can take advantage of it later. But again, it's this question, it looks simple, but there are many other opportunities buried in the interface. So this is, again, my argument on why you might want to start off with somebody who's done this 100 times versus taking it on yourself, because I worry you miss opportunities that you don't know that are buried in the interface. So it's trickier than it looks, but it's worth doing. That would be my concern on the challenge side.
Great. Kelly, thanks so much. That's the end of our questions, the end of our program. Kelly, thanks ever so much for the fabulous session today. So much great content in this hour. So really appreciate you being with us. My pleasure. Thanks everybody for attending. We'll see you next week for search engine optimization with an emphasis on organic link building via video assets. Bye-bye, everybody. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye, Kelly.
Bye.